What's going on? It's Joe Till, and this is episode 3 of the Agnostic Bible Study. This podcast is a verse-by-verse breakdown of the Bible, and we are approaching it from a curious, neutral perspective. This show is not about trying to convert anybody or deconvert anybody. It's about slowing down, opening the text, and asking honest questions. So whether you believe, you don't believe, or you don't know what to believe, you are welcome here at the Agnostic Bible Study. Let's get into it. All right, guys, so let's get into the show. If you watched episode 1 and 2, you know that we have decided to start in the Gospel of Mark. And if you were hoping for me to finally open the Bible today, I do apologize. We have one more topic to discuss, and then the next episode, I promise, we will start in Mark chapter 1. But before we start reading the Gospel of Mark line by line, we need to stop and ask an important question. Who actually wrote this? Because the authorship is going to change everything that comes next. If this gospel was written by someone who personally traveled with Jesus, heard him teach, and witnessed events firsthand, that's one kind of historical source. If it was written decades later by someone collecting stories and traditions that had been passed down, that is a different kind of source. And I want to be very clear, this is not about trying to discredit anything. It's about understanding what kind of document we're reading before we interpret it. Most of us grew up hearing the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and naturally assuming that those were the authors. But when you actually open the text and look closely, something important becomes clear. The Gospel of Mark never tells us who wrote it. There's no first-person introduction, no signature, no claim of authorship inside the document itself. It is anonymous. It's also written in a third-person narrative style. The author never steps into the story as a character or claims to be describing events he personally witnessed. Instead, the story is told from an outside perspective, sometimes even describing private moments or thoughts of different characters. That doesn't necessarily tell us who the author was. Ancient writers could gather information from many sources, but it does mean the gospel reads more like a composed narrative than a personal memoir written by someone telling their own story. And I just recently learned that the title was added later. Most modern Bibles say the gospel according to Mark at the top, but that title wasn't a part of the original document. See, if you look right there, maybe I can zoom in, you can see it, the gospel according to Mark. When this gospel was first written, it likely would have circulated as a written account of Jesus' life without a formal title attached. As more written accounts began circulating among early Christian communities, believers needed a way to distinguish them, and that's when titles like According to Mark begin to appear. So that name reflects the early church tradition about who the author was believed to be. And that doesn't automatically mean that the tradition is wrong. It just means the attributions developed over time as these writings started circulating. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in this episode. So let's talk briefly about when the Gospel of Mark was written. Most scholars date the Gospel of Mark somewhere around 65 to 75 AD. That estimation comes from clues inside the text itself. In Mark 13, Jesus predicts the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. The way that prediction is described sounds very familiar to what actually happened when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. Because of that, many historians think Mark was written either shortly before that event or sometime soon after it, when those events were still fresh in their memory. It's not an exact science. That and some other reasons that are a little bit too complicated for us to get into right now is why a lot of modern scholars place the Gospel of Mark being written in that time period. Now, here is where it gets really, really interesting. The first surviving reference connecting the Gospel to someone named Mark doesn't appear until the early 2nd century. Comes from a church writer named Papias, writing somewhere between 110 and 130 AD. By the time we get to about 180 AD, a writer named Irenaeus clearly refers to all 4 Gospels by the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and treats those attributions as established. So there's roughly a century between when Mark was likely written and when we see those author names clearly documented together in surviving sources. That gap is what historians examine very, very very carefully. So let's talk about Papias. The earliest surviving source connecting this gospel to Mark comes from a church writer named Papias, writing somewhere between 110 and 130 AD. Now, we don't have Papias' original book anymore, but later church historians preserve some of his statements. Here's what Papias says about Mark. Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately whatever he remembered of the things said or done by the Lord, though not, however, in order. For he never heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterward followed Peter, who used to give teachings as necessity demanded, but not making an orderly arrangement of the Lord's sayings. So Mark committed no error in writing down some things as he remembered them. For he made it his one concern not to omit anything he had heard or falsify anything. So Papias is the earliest mention of Mark writing some type of gospel, and this is 40 to 60 years later. And there's a lot to zero in on this. So according to Papias, Mark was not an eyewitness. And Papias says Mark wrote accurately, though not necessarily in chronological order. He's described as someone recording Peter's preaching, and Papias says he never even met Jesus. Papias is important, but historians still examine him very carefully. First, he's writing decades after the gospel was likely written. Second, we only have his words because later writers preserved them, mainly Eusebius, writing in the 4th century. And third, some of Papias' other statements raise questions. After Papias makes the statement about Mark, he then makes a statement about Matthew. This is where the first red flag came up for me because I've really studied Matthew a lot. This is what he says about Matthew. Matthew compiled the sayings in the Hebrew language, and each interpreted them best as he could. That description doesn't clearly match the Greek gospel of Matthew that we have today, which reads more like an original Greek composition, a narrative, and uses large portions of Mark. So scholars debate what Papias is referring to. Is he describing an earlier sayings collection that no longer exists, a different version, or is he preserving a developing tradition? There's also a later tradition attributed to Papias describing Judas's death in a way that clearly doesn't line up with how Matthew describes it. In the Gospel of Matthew, it is very clear Judas hangs himself. But Papias seems to preserve a much more expanded and legendary version of Judas' death circulating in early Christian tradition. He swells up, he gets real nasty, and there's pus coming out of him and stuff. And I think he gets ran over by like a chariot or something. So I had this moment of like, he says that Matthew wrote some type of gospel, but the way he describes it, a Hebrew sayings gospel, and then what we have today is a Greek narrative, and then he doesn't seem to know how Judas dies in Matthew. It's all strange to me. That doesn't seem to add up. That doesn't automatically make Papias unreliable, but it does show he was passing along traditions that were still developing and not always uniform. So historians tend to see Papias as an important early witness to what Christians believed about the origins of these texts, but not necessarily as someone with direct firsthand knowledge of who wrote them. But like I said earlier, by the time we get to about 180 AD from Irenaeus, we clearly get the mention of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and after that, the tradition does seem to be very stable. I'm not here to tell you what to believe. I'm here to present the facts, and I hope that you make your own conclusion about what you think happened in that gap. So who is this Mark that the church has traditionally said wrote this gospel? The Mark most early Christians connect to this gospel is usually identified with someone called John Mark, who appears in the book of Acts. In Acts, we're told his mother owned a house in Jerusalem where early believers gathered. He later travels with Paul and Barnabas on a missionary journey, but drama strikes. During that journey, he leaves and returns to Jerusalem. We're not told why. Later, when Paul wants to revisit those churches, Barnabas wants to bring Mark again, but Paul refuses. And the disagreement becomes so sharp that Paul and Barnabas actually split ways over this. Barnabas takes Mark, Paul takes Silas, and this is a serious moment in early Christianity. I want to read these verses. After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Come, let us return and visit the brothers and sisters in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they're doing." Barnabas wanted to take with them John, called Mark, but Paul decided not to take with them one who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not accompanied them in the work. The disagreement became so sharp that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and set out, the brothers and sisters commending him to the grace of the Lord. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So I like that Mark is not portrayed as like a flawless apostle. He is a secondary figure moving in early Christian circles. Over time, early Christian tradition connects this Mark to Peter, and from there develops the idea that he recorded Peter's teaching in written form. But I think it's important to point out, the gospel itself never identifies its author as this Mark. And the connection between the gospel writer and the Mark in Acts comes from early church tradition rather than from the text itself. It is plausible, but historically speaking, it is still a tradition. And you might be wondering, you might say, why does this matter? None of this automatically determines whether the stories in Mark are true or false. Authorship just helps us understand what kind of document we're reading. Are we reading a first-hand memoir, a preserved oral tradition, a theological narrative written decades later? Those are different categories. But regardless of where someone lands on that question, this text becomes one of the most influential writings in human history. It shaped Christianity, influenced other gospels, as I will show you later. And it continues to shape how millions of people understand Jesus. So it deserves to be read carefully and honestly. As we move forward in this study, we're not assuming the tradition is false, and we're not assuming it's automatically true. We're simply acknowledging what we know and what we don't know. This gospel is anonymous. Later tradition connects it to Mark and to Peter. Papias is our earliest surviving source for that tradition, but historians still debate how directly that tradition goes back to the original author. With that in mind, next episode, we finally open the text itself, the very first line of the Gospel of Mark, because how this story begins tells us a lot about what the author thought was most important. So once again, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Agnostic Bible Study. I truly am enjoying doing this show, and I hope you're learning a lot. I really hope I'm living up to my goal of presenting this information to y'all in a neutral way. I really don't want to force my conclusions on you. I just want to show you the information. If I'm being 100% honest, I'm not all the way sold on that Mark being the one that wrote that gospel, but that doesn't matter. I still believe my insight can help the believer, the non-believer, and the don't know what to believer. So I'll see y'all next week as we get into Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist. We'll see y'all later.